Welcome to Comics Bazaar, the channel of comics commentary and arcana. This video features Uncanny X-Men number 200, cover dated December 1985, and this is a special double-sized issue. So front and center here we've got Magneto, who's in chains, and he is facing trial in the interior of the comic. We also have a battle between the X-Men and these two unidentified characters here, but inside we learn their identity. They are the Strucker twins, Andreas and Andrea, and we also learn who their father is, Baron Wolfgang von Strucker, the super Nazi and also former head of Hydra, and we learn that their codename is Fenris. So let's open this one up. Oh yeah, one other thing to note is we see here on or in the corner box that Magneto has been included along with the X-Men, and that is predictive of something that occurs at the end of this issue. So let's open it up to the splash page here, and we've got our story title, The Trial of Magneto, and we learn that the trial is taking place in Paris, France. And the captions here are by Neil Conan, NPR radio announcer and journalist, and a personal friend of Chris Claremont in real life. So he's inserted his own friend here as the radio announcer who catches the reader up on what's going on in this issue. Our creative team here, Chris Claremont, writer, John Romita Jr. and Dan Green, artist. So Romita Jr. is providing breakdowns and Dan Green is finishing them. Glynis Oliver, colorist, and Tom Orzechowski, letterer. Just another point to note about this issue is that in May 1985, the creative team, Claremont, Romita Jr., Dan Green, and Nocenti, the editor, went on a European tour, and I think their first port of call was Paris, France. So they were doing some research there for this issue, Romita Jr. in particular making sketches of various locations in the city that he would use then in this issue. So pretty cool that Romita Jr. got to do his research for the art on site rather than relying on photographs. So we get a little recap here of some of the key events in Magneto's backstory as supervillain. This is very important in the issue. A story that goes back to Defenders number 15 and 16, 1974 by Len Wein, where Magneto was reduced to infancy by this character here, Mutant Alpha, and then Claremont brought him back as an adult in Uncanny X-Men 104. But that's important in terms of a point that comes up in the trial itself. So this is recapping the end of the previous issue 199, when Freedom Force, headed up by Mystique, arrested Magneto, and he agreed to undergo trial. So the trial is taking place in Paris, France. We get to see some landmarks like the Arc de Triomphe, and then the trial itself is taking place at the Palais de Justice on the Ile de la Cité, only a block from Notre Dame Cathedral. And here we have Sir James Jaspers, a character that Claremont has taken from Alan Moore and Alan Davis's run on Captain Britain. Now this is 616, so to speak, Jim Jaspers or Sir James Jaspers, so doesn't have the reality warping powers so far as we know as the one that Claremont and Davis explore in their issues of Captain Britain. This here is Gabrielle Haller. By the way, Sir James Jaspers is the prosecutor, and Gabrielle Haller is Magneto's defender. And she has as her advisor Charles Xavier, so Professor X. And they're here on the steps of the Palais de Justice, observing this baying crowd who are baying for Magneto's blood, and they're expressing anti-mutant sentiment. So if we continue, the scene switches to the Mediterranean and a super yacht, which it turns out is owned by the twins, Andrea and Andreas. who have something of a slightly, it's implied, slightly incestuous relationship. But in fact, what they're doing here is they are planning to slaughter Xavier, Haller, and Magneto all together. So we'll see how that pans out later in the issue. Then we go back to Paris and the Bagatelle part of the western outskirts of Paris. And what we have here is an interesting moment where the X-Men and the New Mutants, who were whisked off to Asgard in the New Mutants Special Edition #1, an X-Men Annual #9, are returned to Earth. Loki keeping his promise to send them back to their mentor, Professor X, but they're taken by surprise that they turn up in Paris. We've got this funny little editorial note from Ann Nocenti, where she gives us that information, but she tells us that Claremont will really and truly shoot Chris if he ever pulls as stupid a scheduling stunt as this again, and she really means it, because this is all sandwiched in between 199, previous issue, and this one. So we've got our two teams turning up in Paris here, and of course they startle the Parisians who are in the park, and basically Cyclops orders Rachel to create a telepathic diversion. So she convinces the gathered crowd that George Lucas is in town filming a new movie with absolutely spectacular special effects. So nicely done by Rachel. Then we've got some intrigue going on a few days later in Poland, where at a Red Army base, these mysterious figures show up, destroy the base, and leave a graffiti message behind: "Free Magneto, signed the X-Men." So then the scene switches to the Ritz in Paris, the hotel, where Professor X is lying on his bed there. Perspective is pretty extreme here. He looks teeny tiny there. The bed must be absolutely huge, like 20 feet long. I think that's something maybe Romita Jr. would want to go back and fix. And Professor X is hearing the news from Neil Conan over the radio about what's going on in Poland, and then he gets a heart attack. So Professor X was badly beaten outside Columbia University in Uncanny X-Men 192, and in the previous issue 199, our previous issue to this, 199, Moira McTaggart reveals that he's not doing well. In fact, he's dying. His organs are shutting down and he's having heart troubles. So he is compensating for this using his psi talent, and Scott knocks at the door and comes in. Professor is kind of slightly recovered, but Scott knows because Moira's told him that Professor X is dying, and he's angry that the professor doesn't trust him enough to tell him that that's the case. So Cyclops is saying that the X-Men are going to stay with Professor X, and Professor X talks with him about how the X-Men are being framed, as is Magneto. And Scott is skeptical of Magneto, going all the way back to X-Men #1 and the original X-Men's battles with Magneto in the Silver Age. He finds it a little hard, Professor, to risk his life for a man who's tried more than once to kill him. And Professor X responds, "I understand your ambivalence, Scott, but I also ask that you respect my judgment. Magneto has vowed to accept any decision of the court." So they're a little bit at odds on this, but Professor X sets the X-Men the task of finding the true culprits of the terrorist attack in Poland. And then there's a huge protest outside the court building, and then we go inside for the trial. So we have the judges are taken from the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, and the Chief Justice is the French judge here in the middle, and Jim Jaspers addresses the bench, arguing that Magneto is a criminal. He is killed, he is robbed, he's wantonly destroyed more than once. He's brought the world to the brink of Armageddon. So Jaspers presses a strong case against Magneto and his past history. Then we get this scene set in West Germany, where a United States States Air Force plane is shot down. And once again, we get this graffiti left at the scene, implicating the X-Men in the damage. So then we go back inside the court here, and we have Gabrielle Haller arguing that the court should strike out any actions of Magneto's for consideration for judgment prior to his confrontation with Mutant Alpha at the United Nations. And there's a protest from someone in the gallery about this, and she continues with her justification for this. At that time, Magneto was reduced to infancy, returned to a state of grace. His life can be said to have begun again. The man that was, at that moment, ceased to exist. In effect, he died, which is, of course, the ultimate penalty for any crime. So this is Claremont's way of basically doing away with Silver Age Magneto and leaving only his Magneto, the Magneto he's written since Uncanny X-Men 104, on trial here at court. So Jaspers objects, but ultimately the judge finds for the defense. The indictment is restricted to those specifications which occurred after Magneto's quote-unquote resurrection. And then we have a little interscene with the X-Men who are residing in an apartment on the left bank of the Seine, and they're trying to figure out how they should track down the culprits for these terrorist actions, and they're trying to figure out what might be a likely target in Paris. Then we're back at the court, and all those charges concerning Silver Age Magneto stricken. And then we get quite a negative reaction from the gallery at the court. And then we have Jim Jaspers summoning his first witness for the prosecution, who happens to be a Soviet admiral, commander-in-chief of the Soviet Navy's strategic missile submarine force. So we're going to find out what all that's about in due course. Now we're with the X-Men who are posted at various locations around Paris that they believe might be targeted. And Colossus and Nightcrawler are taking care of a hospital. And that's what's attacked. So Nightcrawler orders Colossus to radio the others so that they can converge on the hospital. So then we got this scene where Colossus here takes on these armored actors who have caused the damage. And of course there we have, they're signing their work, Free Magneto, implicating the X-Men. So quite dynamic fight scenes here, action from John Romita Jr. And you can see too that Claremont is holding off on the narrative captions, allowing the art to do the talking, so to speak. And then we have the arrival of the other X-Men, but Rogue is bringing in Cyclops and Rachel, but they hit something which they can't quite figure out what it is. It's indicated here, and so it's going to take some time to figure out what caused that. It's the person wielding that power blast who's the real threat, so we'll find out who that is in due course. Then the Parisian police arrive, aiming their guns at the X-Men, but Rachel deals with that with her telekinesis, and then Cyclops orders her to cloud everyone's perceptions to mask our escape. So the X-Men working like a well-oiled machine, but Cyclops is miffed at these terrorists getting the drop on them and implicating them, so he blasts away the graffiti there. But despite his action, the newspapers the next day blaring with the headline "X-Men Attack Hospital." So then we have some missiles thrown at, rotten fruit thrown at Gabrielle Haller and Professor X, and they're being looked after by Kitty Pryde, who inside their office in the Palais de Justice is upset by the crowd and their hatred for mutants. But Gabrielle Haller tells her it's easy to run away or give up, as my parents did. They were lucky. They died in Bergen-Belsen. For them, the pain ended quickly. They've no memories to haunt them, no more fears. But we who survived have a certain duty to make certain the Holocaust never happens again to anyone. We must fight, Kitty. We may be defeated, but we must never surrender. So Claremont making the theme of genocide part and parcel of the trial of Magneto here. So quite a serious subtext and theme to this story. And of course, Magneto revealed in Uncanny X-Men 150 as an inmate of Auschwitz himself. Then the scene switches to an ocean away, so Professor X's mansion in upstate New York. And who's there home alone except for a very heavily pregnant Madelyne Pryor? And she is listening to the TV and the news from Neil Conan about what's going on in Paris with Magneto about to take the stand. And interesting, in her thought balloons here, we learn that she feels so helpless. Why hasn't Scott called? He and the X-Men returned from Asgard over a week ago, and are things so tough over there? Is he so busy? Others have phoned, Aurora, Nightcrawler and Kitty, almost every day. Bless her. Doesn't Scott want to talk to me? Has he forgotten I exist? Probably. So Claremont there characterizing, part of his characterization of Scott is he's all duty and he's forgetting about his heavily pregnant wife. Really doesn't reflect well on Scott at all. Let me know what you think about that in the comments to this video and what Claremont's up to there. As Madelyne says herself to her, well, not to herself, to her baby, I love your father dearly, but sometimes he can be a real jerk. And that is a bit jerky from him. And then suddenly there's a flash, and who arrives via Stargate except for Corsair, who is Scott's father, Chris Summers, and Lilandra, Empress of the Shi'ar Empire and beloved of Professor X. And she has learned of Professor X's sickness, and they're there to bring him aboard the Starjammer and help him. But he's not there, of course. He's in Paris, so they're in a rush and they go back from where they've come, which we're going to see shortly. But what happens is their sudden arrival and the shock to Madelyne sets off her contractions, a big one. So she's all alone in the X-Mansion, and it seems like her baby's been born. Then we go to space, on the fringes of the Shi'ar space, and Binary's been keeping open the Stargate, and Corsair and Lilandra emerge again from the Stargate. They're back, and there's a whole debate now about going through the Stargate again, but they're under fire. The ship is under fire from other ships. It's a Shi'ar battle group are attacking them, and the Starjammer shields are holding, but they won't last indefinitely. So they're under time pressure here, and both Lilandra and Corsair are prepared to go through the Stargate a second time to try to get to Professor X. And then we go back to Paris and the office in the... actually, no, it's on the left bank of the Seine. So we're seeing the protest at the Palais de Justice, and Kitty is again upset by it. But this time round, it turns out the protesters are all pro-mutant, and they're declaring pro-mutant sentiments. So it turns out that Kitty's actually losing the acuity of her eyesight and as she thinks here, she's an X-Men, but she's going to need some glasses. So then back to the trial, and back to the Soviet general, and he gives evidence that Magneto sunk the submarine Leningrad. This goes back to Uncanny X-Men 150. And he says Magneto threatened us. The Soviet Union acted in self-defense. Then we're back with the X-Men on the left bank, and Rachel uses her power, the power she used to track down mutants in her dystopian future, in order to zero in on the origin of the power blast that struck her, Rogue, and Cyclops, and also Colossus. So she zeroes in on it. She's got them. And then back to the trial, and Magneto has a response as he takes to the stand to Jasper's witness. He says here, I freely admit the destruction of both the warship and the Siberian city of Varikino, although the latter was done in such a way as to ensure no loss of life. And basically, James Jaspers is getting riled up by Magneto. He hates him. And Magneto's response is, by what right do those self-same great powers hold me hostage with their nuclear arsenals? I'm a citizen of neither the United States nor the Soviet Union, yet they possess the capability to slay me and mine. I live, I prosper solely because two men on opposite sides of the globe choose to keep the peace. I can just as easily as arbitrarily be condemned. Unlike others, however, I have the power to do something about it. I thought mistakenly those nations would best understand their own language of violence. Unfortunately, force begat force, and as always, innocence paid the price. A price I discovered too late that was too high. So Magneto explains that his Silver Age intention was driven by the fact that humans slaughter each other because of the color of their skin, faith, or politics, or for no reason at all. Too many of you hate as easily as you draw breath. What's to prevent you adding us to the list? I thought I could impose sanity from above through conquest, but there are too many of you, so I decided I must try another way. I am the reason mutants are unjustly feared. That is why I'm here, why I will abide by the court's decision. My hope is to make the world understand the reasons for my being, but most of all to punish me for my crimes and no longer my people. And he concludes his speech here, I've seen the error of my ways, can you say the same? So no protests from the gallery on this point of Magneto's. So, and the captions tell us as Magneto speaks, a Batu Mouche cruises up the Seine, crowded with tourists whose happy waves are returned by those on shore. But then we have the X-Men jumping into the boat, and because Rachel has located the armored terrorists again, and here now we get a fight between the X-Men and these guys. And we have Colossus throwing Wolverine into the fray here with a fastball special. And so we've got pages now here of the combat between the X-Men and the armored terrorists. I really like this page here. So Claremont standing back and allowing Romita Jr.'s art to do the speaking. And here we have the rose window of Notre Dame, and Colossus being knocked right through that window. And I like the colouring here from Glynis Oliver, picking up on the multicolours of that particular rose window. Anyone who's been to Paris and has seen it will know what I'm talking about. So Colossus is in trouble here as the armoured guys follow him in to finish him. And we get another landmark of Paris. Of course, you can't have a story set in Paris without seeing the Eiffel Tower, and here is John Romita Jr.'s version of it. And so as the fight continues, what happens is it's actually a diversion, and the palace itself is blasted into, and here we have the arrival of who's been behind those terrorist attacks, Fenris. Okay, so that's Andrea and Andreas von Strucker, and they're there to kill Professor X, Gabrielle Haller, and Magneto first and foremost. So, two fights rage now in parallel. Out on the Seine between the X-Men and the Armored Goons, and then in the Palais de Justice, Fenris versus Magneto here. And they say to Magneto that they are there for revenge. For too many years, Swine, the humiliation and defeat suffered by our beloved father at your hands has gone unavenged. Today, at long last, you shall pay. So Magneto's wondering what are they talking about and who do they mean? But he stands his ground. And the ground beneath him is destroyed by Fenris's power blasts. So he, Gabrielle, and Professor X fall through the floor into the tunnels or basement beneath the Palais, and Fenris follow them down. But Rachel now arrives to even out the battle. And what happens here is that Jim Jaspers, well, actually, first and foremost, Professor X is able to break up the twins because their powers only work when they're in physical contact with each other. And as he does that, Jim Jaspers grabs Rock and prepares to kill Andrea, but he's stopped by Magneto, and the head judge is absolutely disgusted with Jim Jaspers. Magneto had no rock in his hand, Sir James. His power could have crushed those children, yet he chose to be merciful. Truly, monsieur, an inhuman act. So Magneto has proved himself more humane, more noble than the prosecutor, James Jaspers. So what happens here is that Professor X determines that Fenris should be turned over to the French authorities. But just as he does so, the Fenris twins make physical contact again, and they make their escape. But not before blasting the walls of the basement, allowing the Seine to pour in to the catacombs underneath the Palais. And Professor X and Magneto are dragged out by the current into the river, and Magneto saves them both, pulling them up through the ground onto the grass here. But this has truly been too much for Professor X, who has been, suffered a heart attack earlier in the issue, and who is physically wrecked and shutting down here. And he makes, because he thinks he's dying, he makes Magneto promise to take over from him. Promise me, Magneto, you'll carry on in my place, take over my school, look after my X-Men, teach the new mutants. And Magneto is reluctant to agree. Impossible, they'll never accept me. Are you afraid? Professor X asks him, and with good reason, Magneto responds. Charles, I'm not worthy of your trust, of this awesome responsibility. Please do not ask me for what I cannot give. But Professor X insists. And so Magneto ultimately says it will be hard, but he'll try. And just at that moment, Corsair and Lilandra arrive, and Lilandra realizes they're just in time to perhaps save Professor X if they can bring him aboard the Starjammer and get Sikorsky to look him over and treat him medically. The Starjammer's physician. So Magneto is relieved, and the agreement here is if all goes well, we'll return you here hale and hearty within the hour. So they take Professor X through the Stargate to the Starjammer ship. And Professor X makes Magneto reiterate his promise that he will take over from the Professor if the Professor doesn't return. And Magneto says, you think you know me better than I do myself? Suppose I fail and betray your dream. Our dream, blast you, and we'll never know if you don't try. So that's where it's left between Professor X and Magneto. And then we switch to Paris Police Headquarters, and the X-Men arrive with the defeated armored goons, who they leave there and tell the Paris Police now it's their turn to clean up the mess. And here we are, our final page. So what happens is that it's accepted that Magneto can leave because, as the head judge here says, it's all been rendered moot. Whatever a court of law decides, his fate, that's Magneto's fate, and the X-Men's, is now before the courts of public opinion. The people of the world will determine their innocence or guilt and whether their story has a truly happy ending. So Rachel realizes that Professor X is gone, and then we have our final two panels with Magneto, who says, "I gave you my word, Charles. Come what may, I will be true to it. Professor X hasn't returned within the hour." So there you go, the double-sized special 200th issue of the X-Men, set in Paris, the trial of Magneto, and setting up a new status quo. We won't see Professor X again for quite some time in relation to the X-Men, not until he's returned at the end of Claremont's run. And Magneto, of course, will take over as head of school at the New Mutants, or for the New Mutants. So quite a change of status quo here, and I hope that you enjoyed the video. If you did, please like the video, and if you haven't done so already, subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for more content like this.